Okay, if it messes up, Nikki, if it messes up, give me a holler, because that means that it's coming undone there. Well, good morning, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here today. Our Memorial Day weekend coming up, and or is now here. We're going to go to the book of Mark, and this will be our last class for the summer. Our last Sunday school class. We take a break for the adult class from after Memorial Day till right after Labor Day. And we're going to be in Mark 16 today to start with. And so there'll be no coffee fellowship after today either. So get tanked up on your coffee before you come. So the rest of you guys, you'll be picked up at 10 next week instead of 9. All right? Same time it always does. 10:30, yeah. Same time it always does. And but there'll be no coffee fellowship before church. Yeah. And then the summer schedule helps all the people who regularly take care of the coffee fellowship. Helps me out with the summer with my busy schedule. The summer schedule gets busier, and we will resume our normal class again in September after Labor Day. Okay.
Mark would be next.
More guys will still be coming. Nick was stopping by to pick up 2 more guys from the mission, but he ran into closed roads due to flooding coming from Shrewsbury, so he had to go around. So eventually get here. Okay, let's open in prayer. Father, I thank you that we have time today to open the Bible and study your word, and I pray today that you'll bless us as we conclude our study of the book of Mark. And thank you for the attendance and the interest throughout this winter and fall and spring, and pray now that you'll bless us as we take time to look at this. In Jesus' name, amen. Come on in, everybody. What are you doing on crutches? How you doing? You broke your foot?
Yeah. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing good. Zach, how you been?
Great, excellent.
So Nick finally got to you, huh?
Yeah.
That's good. So, okay, I got to ask, how did you break your foot?
I'm playing volleyball.
Oh, with the kids.
Yeah, I collided with someone.
Wow. Jonathan is the volleyball coach for the school he teaches at. And he showed them what not to do, I guess, right? Wow. How long are you going to be on the crutches? They'll put a walking cast on eventually?
Yes.
Okay. Tom, is it?
Yes.
Good to see you today, Tom. Thanks for coming today. That's good. That's good. Okay, we are going to conclude our study in Mark today, Mark 16. And this will be our last adult class for the summer. And as I mentioned before, which is the sad part for most people, no coffee fellowship also. So just come for church at 10:30. And then we'll resume again in September, okay? Let me read chapter 16 to you. It's not real long. Let me read it, and you follow along, please. And if you're using the Bibles from the pews, or you'll see that from verse 9 down, it's in italics. And it says there's a note there that we're going to talk about today as some of our class. Verse 1 of chapter 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "Are you looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified? He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, Tell his disciples and Peter, he is gone ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. He said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all nations. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe in my name. They will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people, and they will all get well." After the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up to heaven, and he sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it. Okay, do you see some strange things there?
Yeah.
What do you see that's strange?
It appeared to them in a different form in the countryside.
Okay.
I asked myself what form made that appear.
Okay, that is a takeoff on what Luke says in his gospel about when Jesus walked with the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, but they didn't recognize him in his person, but he didn't have a different form of a different thing like that. They didn't recognize him. What else do you see it's strange here? Did you notice any kind of change in the flow of the passage? Well, let me, as you're thinking about that, give you some information. Verses 9 through 20 do not appear in the earlier manuscripts of the New Testament. The New Testament started to be written about 60 AD when it first started to be written, and Mark was the first gospel to be written, the first of the gospels to be written. And these manuscripts that were shared amongst the churches were shared with each other, and then eventually they were copied very meticulously by scribes, New Testament scribes, people who would write it perfectly, would copy these and send them to the churches as Christianity was growing. Christianity started out in Jerusalem, right? Where the day of Pentecost, they're just in Jerusalem. And from there it spread. Where do you think Christianity spread to first? What area of the country, of the world, did it spread to first? Asia. Well, it went to Asia Minor, with where Antioch, the city of Antioch. And if you look at a map, Christianity spread northeast into Asia Minor, into Asia, and then where we would say today is modern-day Turkey and places like that. And then it went southeast into Africa. Some of the earliest churches were in Ethiopia, Africa. That part of Africa had a lot of Christian churches in it, and it grew very fast in Africa. And then it went eventually north into what became eventually Europe. It went in those 3 directions. As the church spread, the need to have scriptures for people to read also spread with it. And so more and more copies were being made of the New Testament writings, of the Gospels and the Epistles. More and more copies were being made. There are over 3,000 copies of the New Testament extant today, in existence today. Not all of them complete. I believe the number is 300 complete or 30 full New Testaments, something like that. But it's a large, substantial number of them. Do you know how many extant copies there are of Shakespeare?
Oh, I don't know.
Very few compared to the Bible.
Not in manuscript.
Not in manuscript at all.
0 manuscript.
Oh, okay. So the Bible is unique in that sense. And as Christianity spread, the need spread, and so copies. By the time that the King James Version, the 1611 version of the English Bible was translated, there were many copies, but all of them were older. There was nothing earlier than a 10th century manuscript that they had to translate from. And they also had, some portions had to be from Latin, from Jerome's Bible to translate from. So they didn't have earlier manuscripts. The study of manuscripts, early manuscripts, accelerated in the 19th century and 20th century. And today there are many, many, many copies that we have, and much earlier. I think that the earliest, I should have looked this up this morning. My mind drops a lot of these dates. I think the earliest manuscript we have is like a 120 AD. We have a portion of the Gospel of John from 120 AD. But they have 1st and 2nd century manuscripts complete that have been found. Now, what happened is, when you look at the earlier manuscripts of the Bible, you don't find Mark chapter 16 verses 9 through 20 in any of those manuscripts. They're not there. They don't appear until later. And they appear only in one of those 3 sections where the gospel went, and people became believers. But once it appeared, it started to get recopied then, and recopied and recopied. And so the majority of manuscripts, they have a name, Byzantine manuscripts and the Alexandria manuscripts and others. The ones that the King James Bible was translated from followed a certain vein of the manuscripts. And in those manuscripts, this portion is included in the Gospel of Mark. Bill?
Did Mark actually write that portion?
Well, that's a good question. Bill says, did Mark actually write that portion? Well, according to evangelical scholars, they would say no. Because for several reasons. One is that it's not found in any of the earlier manuscripts. And the scribes were very meticulous about not leaving things out. Sometimes, as they would copy a manuscript, they would put a note in the margin to explain something. And as that manuscript went to a certain area and it kept getting copied, eventually sometimes that note from the margin got put into the text. But through scholastic studies, they're able to find things like that. And that's why some changes have been made in newer translations, because they have found where this only went to that direction and it was added at this point, eventually was put into the text. Because with 5,000 manuscripts or portions of manuscripts extant today, there's a lot they can compare to. You understand that? So your newer Bibles, the newer versions of Bibles, all are based upon a larger and more accurate and earlier transcripts of the Bible to translate from than the older English Bibles we have were able to have. Okay? So, there are things in the grammar stylistically, that don't follow Mark's style in the rest of his book. So for that reason, scholars say they don't think it was, they don't say it's written by Mark. The fact that it was not found in 2 of the directions the Bible went, only in 1, also indicates to them that it wasn't part of the original writing of Mark. Also, the fact that some things are said here that are not said in other places, and some of the things that are mentioned in a different way. when he starts to write this in chapter 16, which would be very short, in verse 8, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. This is similar to what Matthew and Luke have in their accounts, though Matthew and Luke have a lot more to say about it than Mark. Remember, Mark was the earliest one written, and what he paid attention to wasn't always the same things that the other guys paid attention to. When you read the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered the synoptic gospels, meaning they cover the same events, basically share the same stories. John differs from them a little bit, covers some of the events, but has other things that are different, found only in John. But when you but Matthew and Luke are later in their writings, and people wanted to know more, and God, the Holy Spirit, gave them more to write. And it's almost like if you took an event and you had three, I'm simplifying this greatly, it's not exactly like this, but if you had an event and you had three writers looking at the event, one is at the face, one's on the back, one's on the side, they report on what they saw and what they see. They're going to have a lot of the same things, but there's going to be differences as well from the viewpoint they're at and what God's trying to emphasize. Both Matthew and Luke talk about an earthquake happening that may have been the thing that rolled the stone away, or it could have just been the angel rolled it away.
Does that mean that like Jesus like literally changed the word to make it perfect?
Jesus changed the word?
Yeah, like he like you know how you just said that some of the scripts like might have gone away. Like, does that mean that like?
Well, this happens long after he died. Mm-hmm. Is that scholarship has gone back and found through archaeological digs. They have found earlier manuscripts, and the most reliable manuscripts are the earlier ones, not the later ones. Because even if you use, when they went through all kinds of things to try to do this exact, and I don't want to bore you with the kinds of stuff they did, but even then, human error can come in. That's why there can be some differences.
Right.
Thankfully, there's nothing where you have differences. There's nothing that changes any of the major doctrine of God. Because in the scriptures, when God is teaching you something, for example, if God is teaching you about justification by faith, does he have only one or two verses where he says it? No, it's throughout the New Testament, right? When you have Jesus' example of what he did and when he was on earth in the Gospels, you don't have it just one place, you have it several places. So you have this opportunity to keep the full truth of God. It's just the human error sometimes made mistakes. So that's what the NIV and other newer translations are trying to stop and help you understand. Now the authors of the NIV did include it because they want you to see it, because there are older Bibles that do have it. But if you study why it's not there, and they give some explanations, some brief explanations there as well. But this one ends with trembling and bewildered. Well, how does verse 9 start? Verse 9 starts how? Just like verse 1 starts. What's verse 9 talking about? That when Jesus rose early the first day of the week. Right? Verse 1, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices very early the first day of the week. He's already said that. You see what I'm saying? In verses 1 and 2, he's already said what is now being resaid in verse 9.
So it's almost like another account.
It's like another account. And it doesn't have the same style as Mark. And that's what's so different. That's why they don't believe it's part of the inspired Word of God. Now, also, it includes some things there that come from Matthew later. What portion is found only in Matthew later that now is included in this? Look at verse 15. What does it include there? What's that called?
Great Commission.
The Great Commission. Right. That was only to Matthew, in his gospel. Luke, which includes the Road to Emmaus story, is also briefly mentioned here as well, but it's mentioned in a different way. And then there are some things that none other include, which has caused people to scratch their head for a long time, and has even worked towards the development of cultism within Christianity. And what's that?
Snakes.
Handling of snakes
Oh, yeah.
and drinking poison. Do you know how many people have died for thinking that God's going to protect them if they handle poisonous snakes? They're not going to get bit and die, or have drunk poison and have died because of this passage, and faith in the fact that because they think it's part of the Word of God, they could do it and they're going to survive.
But going with the belief that this could be like an afterthought, it almost reflects the story in Acts about Paul when the snake crawled up his arm and he was able to bit him, he was able to shake it off, and he was all right.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it kind of like coincides. It's like
It might have something to do with that. But there's no command anywhere else in Scripture where God says to you, you can do what? Handle snakes, poisonous snakes, and not die, or that you could drink poison and not die. And so in the South, there are still a few churches in the South that I'm aware of that they call them snake handlers, that are very small and they're very off the road a lot, off the mark a lot, who do some of these wild things and believe that they're the only Christians in the world because they can handle snakes and drink poison. And it's trickery, and snake handling, I'll leave it there. I'm not doing it, I'll tell you that much. I do not like snakes.
Pastor,
Yes.
in Revelation, it says, at the end of the book, not for no one to add or take away.
To this book, Revelation.
Oh, just to.
Yeah, people apply it to the whole Bible, but
Okay.
it is to the book of Revelation. Yeah.
PJ, what about in Sermon on the Mount when he's talking about like a jot or a tittle being like taken or added to the law?
Well, that's
Is he
where-
talking about the Old Testament law.
Yes, and Jesus fulfilled that. He said that he is the fulfillment. Nothing was dropped. He fulfilled it all. Nothing was dropped. But there's another thing you mentioned from the book of Acts with the snake, Paul. There's another thing that comes from the book of Acts as well that took place later, that wasn't in any of the Gospels, not later in time, but it wasn't in the Gospels, which was the mention of the tongues, speaking in new languages also. So there is content inside as well as the form and structure, as well as the fact that it's only found in one of the area of the manuscripts, and not until much, much later does it appear. That tells scholars that this is not actually part of Mark's gospel. So that's why it's written the way it's written and put in there. Any questions or comments about that? You do all realize that the original manuscripts that were written by Paul and Peter and John and Matthew and Mark, that there is not any of those that exist. Not any. The best we have is a first century copy. But that also shows you how God protected things and watched over things, because unlike any other literature, there are thousands and thousands of copies that 98.8, I'm giving you a number, percent of them all agree. There are some textual variants in some. Many times it has to do with spelling of a word. Many times it has to do with how a word was misrepresented. For example, in the earlier manuscripts, when they wrote out the manuscript, there are no uppercase, only lowercase, or no lowercase, only uppercase letters used. Okay? There's no spacing breaks between the letters. There's no punctuation. Every letter follows the next letter, the next letter, the next letter. And when you see that on a line, you have to determine what is this word and where does that, and there are words that look like they could be this and not that, and usually the context was the thing that let you know the difference. Did you understand how hard this stuff is? Also, they would use block for the uppercase. They would use block size so that there were so many letters to every page, every line on a papyrus, every line, and then the next line. And so in the whole section, there's only every number of blocks is the same all the way. But there's no punctuation and there's no capitalization. That's why when you read an modern English version today, or any version today, that has to be translated from the original Greek to a Greek that is workable, produced by Bible societies and others, where they have put spaces and they do use uppercase letters and lowercase letters together, and they've made decisions based upon their investigation of the oldest manuscripts. And so there's some difference with them sometimes because of that. But it's nothing ever that deals with a major truth of God. Nothing ever. We had to study the apparatus, it's called, in your Greek New Testament, which I didn't bring one to show you, but hold on. I think I can show you.
Nice.
I can. Here's an example. Ooh, this face scares me. That one scares me. Here's an example. This is the text, and these are decisions made by those who put this text together, that they were following these manuscripts in their decision. And they're all in letters, and they all represent different manuscripts. So that's the text, and that's the apparatus that proves where what evidence they had to support what they chose to say. It's this is the text, and then that's the apparatus that talks about what evidence, what manuscripts support the things that they're saying in their text. So, and it's as little as a spelling of a word. It's as little as leaving out the A, or something like that. So there's the Greek New Testament, and I know you know this. You can read it. You read it better than I can.
I don't think so.
You have apparatus in yours, right?
Actually, I don't think mine's a critical edition. No.
Oh, okay. Just straight through.
Yeah.
Well, this is more helpful when you're studying,
Yeah.
having the critical edition. And then there is a whole book written by Mr. Metzger, who was part of the team of this, that he takes every variant, every time there's a little question, and he explains the support for it and against it, and the book's this thick.
That's awesome.
That where they talk. So it's very particular. There's nothing else in literature that goes through this kind of scrutiny. Nothing else. But it's to show you that the Word of God is authoritative and trustworthy and dependable. Now, when you
when I was in grad school, I studied Chaucer, who's a medieval poet, and his famous work was the Canterbury Tales. And Canterbury Tales has maybe a dozen manuscripts that we've got it in. There's actually a lot, so we feel very confident that we've got a really solid text of the Canterbury Tales, and we know pretty much
with a dozen manuscripts.
Yeah, with pretty much exactly what it went.
And yet, critical scholars criticize the Bible that has a couple thousand manuscripts. So
so we can be really confident that we have a really good text.
Just with 12.
And when it is uncertain, they tell us it's uncertain, like right here.
Yeah,
so we can be confident that what we read is really what they're at.
So you really can have confidence this is the Word of God, that this is the Bible, and that the Bible is written in Hebrew and Greek, the Old Testament Hebrew, some Aramaic, and Greek in the New Testament. And unless you can read Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, you're forced to read a translation. And it's great that translations happen, because every language that the goal of the International Bible Society is to put the Bible in every language. And they've gotten even to small tribes in Papua New Guinea to try to get the Bible in that small tribe's language, so that people can understand the Bible themselves. And obviously, you can't translate it exactly the same. It's not word for word, and it works that way. And the whole science of translation is very, very interesting and very difficult. It's the hardest thing that Bible scholars do today, is to work with the text and try to translate it to another language. Very, very difficult. And that's why what's good is a translation such as all the modern ones we have today are done by teams of people who go through several editing processes with people who haven't seen it before, and to try to do their best to get it as accurate as possible. So that's why there will be differences in English when you're reading English. Do you have the Revised Standard with you today?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Where is the
I have
English
ESV.
Standard Version?
Okay, the ESV, English Standard Version. That will be very close to NIV, except at sometimes a different word will be used, or different word orders used, or sometimes even a whole different meaning to that sentence is given. Not always, but very rarely that happens, because translation is so difficult, and it has two ways it could be understood. And the context will allow both to happen, so the translators have to pay their money and take their choice. They can't put both down. So they'll put one and the other. So a good thing to do today is, and because we have the availability, is to have a couple of really good translations available, so that you can compare and see. Now, I'm not talking about paraphrases. Paraphrases are something else. They take a translation and try to explain it simply to you. That's what a paraphrase does. But a translation tries to stay true to the original languages. And we have so many good ones that you can, without having to have a lot of scholastic background, you can look at it and see what each of them are trying to say, or giving you as possibilities. We live in a very, very great time for Bible reading and study because of this. Other questions on that? Hope you understand and appreciate what that is and the difficulty of it. So every once in a while you will see in the New Testament there will be a verse or two that's italicized and a footnote that says they're not sure that this was part of the original text, but they include it because they want you to be familiar with it, in case you have an older version and you're thinking it is part. Okay? All right. Now, we just read this, and you notice in Mark, the first gospel written, he only has 8 verses dealing with the resurrection of Jesus after the tomb experience, right? Let's go over to Matthew and look at 28, Matthew 28. And I want you to see if you can pick out what things does he say that are different than Mark has said. Okay? As I go along here. Matthew 28. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. What's different there? He mentions 2 of the people, but not 3 of the people. Right? Wasn't 3 mentioned in Mark?
Salome.
Salome?
Yeah, was mentioned in Mark.
Was she mentioned as the mother of, or as a person there?
No, it says Mary, mother of James, and Salome.
Yeah, and Salome, yeah, 3 of them. And it's mentioned there that they went to the tomb. And what else is mentioned in Mark? That they went and purchased spices to go anoint the body. But when Jesus died and was buried, what did we learn there took place with Joseph of Arimathea? What did they do? He went to Pilate, got permission to get the body. He used his tomb, and they wrapped his body with cloths and with spices on the day he died. Now, were these ladies going to take more spices, Some say yes, that the spice packing took place for a while because of the odor. They just kept packing spices on until they could stop the odor. The tomb was a cave in a rock, and the stone that was rolled away is not a round stone in the sense it's three-dimensional. It was like a disc, a round disc that could be moved from its side, and it would slide in a groove so that it couldn't leave the area. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. So here we have the addition of another earthquake. When did we read about an earthquake first in Jerusalem during this time?
When he was on the cross.
When he was on the cross, right? And what may many times accompany a earthquake after you have one? What will accompany many times? You have aftershock tremors. So maybe this was another aftershock or something. But Matthew records it, and nobody else does. It's interesting to see. And so his appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. Now, Mark doesn't mention anything about this. It just says the person was sitting down on the side there. In this account, Matthew says the angel came down from heaven and rolled back, and his appearance was lightning, his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid that they shook and became like dead men. Mark doesn't mention any of that either. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here, he's risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where they lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples. He has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." They all agree and talk about the fact that he told them, "I'll meet you in Galilee. So go ahead and meet to Galilee, and there I will appear to you," which he did do. And here in verse 8, the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid and yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There you will see me." So he includes more information.
Doesn't that seem kind of weird, though, considering Mark was a historian? That wouldn't he be more like detail-oriented?
No, I don't think Mark was a historian. I think when we looked at the introduction, I forget his vocation, but he was the first to write, and his interest wasn't so much all the things that were happening, was to point out the miracles of Jesus and the power of Jesus, the authority of Jesus. That's why for the size of Mark, there's more in there about his miracles and his power than in the other ones. They elaborate more on different stories. Look over at Luke, for example, for the couple minutes we have left. In Luke's Gospel, in 24. This one includes the women, and then it also includes Peter outrunning John to get there, and looking in the tomb and stuff. And verse 12, Peter, however, got up, ran to the tomb, bending over. He saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away wondering to himself what had happened. And in verse 10, it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, and the others with them who told them to the apostles. And then you have a story that's not recorded in the other two, where the road to Emmaus experience that you were mentioning, Lauren, where he was on the road to Emmaus and he was walking with two, and they didn't recognize that it was Jesus. They were kept from recognizing him. And then not until after he left them did they then realize they had been with Jesus, and that's who one was telling them. And then Luke goes on to tell more about his appearance to others, and then his ascension. So Luke has more to record than any of them about the resurrection when Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. I wanted to cover that technical thing Because people often, when they read, will wonder, well, why is this not included in some Bibles? And why is it in italics here? Okay?
Thanks, PJ.
Okay, so you may go back, and I think, Pam went back, so I'm sure she's ready for us. We'll stop 5 minutes early and enjoy your last coffee fellowship for the summer. You can grab a cup on the way next week and drink it on the way. Or stop by Avon Pavilion and get one to go. Okay, very good.